Ablak Gemara. It's Erev Shabbos Kodesh Parshas Chanan, Erev Tu B'Av, the happiest day on our calendar. We are up to the Gemara of Tes Zayin Amud Aleph, right in the middle of the page, the two dots where it says Hachoitek Begodish. Right, if you dug out in a haystack, and we said that such a sukkah is possible. The problem is, so what happened is the straw itself is valid for let's say this chach, but the problem is that how did you create that roof by digging from the inside and suddenly a roof appeared? So that's tasi. You should make it in a kosher way. But layman also shouldn't suddenly appear in a kosher way. Oh, I want to. Leishon is not talking about elisha ancient chavol tefach meshiva. Remember, we learned before that the minimum for a roof, let's say for tumah, is a tefach. If you have the space, the gap of a tefach between the upper layer and whatever's beneath it, then you have a metzius of a roof. So when do we say that there's no roof over here, that there's no gap between the top of this haystack and the rest of the hay is less than a tefach? But if you do have a gap of a tefach for a distance of 7 tvachim, then you have a kosher sukkah because you have schach, and all you now created was the walls. The problem now is if you have already a schach of a tefach, the problem is that, okay, you have a roof, where are your walls? When it comes to walls, there's no prohibition of tas v'loy min asu. Because remember we learned before, sukkah's taslecha. Sukkah is primarily referred to as sukkah al shem schach kores sukkah. It's all about the schach. So regarding the schach, it has to be tas, done in a kosher way. Regarding the walls, it doesn't have to be done in a kosher way. They can appear on its own. Tainamach, we actually learned so in the Braisa, hachoited begodish. If somebody digs out in the haystack, lasel sukkah to make himself a sukkah. We learned somewhere else.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry to disturb. Can you just explain once again what's the pshat when you say echad b'tech shiva? That means one tefach out of every 7, or what does that mean?
No. 1 tefach high, 7 tefach wide.
Okay.
Remember, the minimum size of sukkah is 7 by 7 dimensions with and depth, and the height is 1 tefach. In fact, the Mefarshim ask over here, we won't go into it, but they ask over here, why do you need 7 tvachim? Why don't you have 4 tvachim? We learned before that if you have a majority of a wall, it's good enough. So why don't we just say if it's 1 tefach high over a distance of 4 tvachim, it is kosher. But anyway, it's like the rest of the hay is blocking the imaginary wall from appearing. But that's what it means. So we have a problem. In the Braisa, we learned how if you dig out from a haystack, it is a valid sukkah. And yet now Mishnah says clearly, that so the only way to reconcile that is that we have to make a difference whether there was a gap of a tefach between the schach and the haystack, then it's valid. And if it's no gap, then it's not valid. Shema mina. Ika, others come to the same conclusion, but they ask it initially as a question, not as a proof, but as a question. The Ramile, Mirma, they ask a question. Tanan in our Mishnah says, "Achoited begodish last the sukkah, ain't a sukkah." You dig out a haystack, it's not a sukkah. What time we learn the Braisa, Harei sukkah, it is a sukkah. It's not a problem. Kan b'sheyeshem chavol tefach, there's a gap, a space of a tefach between the hay on top and the bottom. Then we say, yeah, no problem. The meshach shiva of a distance of 7 tvachim. In Canaan, Mishnah talking about you don't have that space of a tefach, and therefore you don't have a roof, and that's why it's tasvul in Nasa. The Gemara continues. Hamishal shel defanis.
Where does the measurement of 10 tefachim height for a sukkah, minimum 10 tefachim high or 7? Where does that come in? How does it fit in with this tefach and the 7?
Very simple. Tefach, the 10 tefachim of sukkah is not in order to create the din of a roof. In order to create there should be a kosher sukkah, it has to be 10 tvachim. As we learned either halacha or we learned from the Aron. It's a sachoisa ala Aron. But the status of a roof is a tefach. So the Torah says that you have to make sure that your roof, when you make your roof, it has to be done in a kosher way. This roof itself has to be kosher. The din of 10 tvachim is a din in the walls of the sukkah. Mm-hmm. In order for a sukkah to be a kosher sukkah, it also needs to have walls 10 tvachim high. And so we're saying as far as 10 tvachim wall, there's no din of tasser v'leimin asur. Now you have a kosher sukkah because now you dug out from within the haystack, and now you have walls that are 10 tvachim high. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it happened automatically. Our only concern is regarding the schach, the roof, and that if there was already a space of a tefach when you built the schach in the first place, then you have your kosher roof. You did it for shade or whatever you did it for. Mishnah. Hamishalshal defanis melmayla mater. Rashi says whenever you build from above and you go downwards, it's called mishalshal. Even though he uses the expression later on that you're weaving you're building the wall, not just putting there at board. If you put it from below, top going below, if it's 3 tvachim above the ground, so it's still possible. Why is it possible? Because we say that a goat can fit underneath. What kind of wall is that? And but if you build a wall starting from the ground, if it's 10 tvachim high, it's kosher, even though this chach is much higher, because we say good asik. Now, working its way down, we do say good achis, but if it's more than 3 tvachim space between the bottom of the wall and the floor, it breaks the good achis, the imaginary wall, because goats can come in. So actually, the Mefarshim have a big problem. The Yeshua and others have a big problem here. So when do we ever have the rule of good achas? Good achas is you imagine, you draw the wall down. You imagine, when is it? The way the Mishnah seems to be learning it is only if it ends somewhere within 3 tvachim. If it ends somewhere within 3 tvachim from the ground, then why do we need the principle of good achas? We have the other rule, which is called lavud. Lavud is that if it's within 3 tvachim, you stretch it down. You can stretch it out. So when do you do good achas? And if it's more than 3 tvachim space, then there's no good achas anymore. You just said that if ghosts can come underneath, it breaks that imaginary wall. So someone answer, it's talking about a wall over water, as we'll soon see. Then we have the rule of good achas.
And where does PT Koyod V'Sosim come in this?
1 second. So good question. So then we have a wall. But what about those? We'll soon see in the Gemara that there are many who hold that you don't say imaginary wall over water. And what does that have to do with sukkahs? So therefore, they want to say that PT Koyod V'Sosim, which means the end. If you have a beam in the front of your sukkah, we imagine that the tip of it forms a wall and comes all the way down. That's when we have the rule of good achas. So the first have been asking the logic, pretty sure again, and others. So what's the logic in that? You have a real wall, and it ends 4 tvachim above the ground. You say no good, because goats can go underneath. When you have no wall, and then you say we don't care if goats go underneath. And that's the rule of good achas. How does that make sense? So somehow or another in logic, you have to work out that no wall is better than having a half a wall. Because when you're having a half a wall, what you're doing is you're imagining that half a wall continues downwards. If you're imagining that half a wall, but it can't, because there's a goat that can go right underneath it. So it's clashing with that imagination. When you have no wall at all, it's not so much you're imagining there's a wall. The halacha says that that's good enough. So the goats doesn't make a difference whether they go in or they go out. There's not an imaginary wall that the goats can break. There is no wall there. But the halacha is that particular is and good achas. So therefore, it's kosher. Anyway, it still needs a lot of explanation. Says further, says, I hold there's no such thing as goats breaking imaginary walls. In other words, it's not the pshat so much that we imagine the walls draw down. The halacha is that if you have a wall, a certain measure, then even though it's 5 tvachim above the ground, that's good enough. Not that we imagine that 5 tvachim, we extend the wall downwards. Then we got a problem. The goat can go right through. But if we say that goof is the halacha, that I don't care if it's 5 tvachim above the ground, as long as you have a wall there, 10 tvachim, that's good enough. That's what Abed is saying. Says Mike Griffith, what's their argument? Marsava, one of them hold mechitza tluya materes. One of them hold a suspended mechitza is also considered a mechitza. Marsava mechitza tluya materes. And the other one hold a suspended mechitza actually is not a valid mechitza. Says the Gemara, what's the story here? The husband looked in the area we learned, you have 2 courtyards, there's a wall in between with the 2 courtyards, so there's no doorway, you can't make an Eder between the 2 courtyards, and there's a well of water right in between the 2 courtyards. Neither of them can draw water on Shabbos because the waters are all mingled together. In your water, you have water from the other's property, and you're not allowed to take from one property to the next without a native. So we learned over there, if you have a cistern, if you have a pit between 2 courtyards, you're not allowed to draw any water from the Shabbos. Unless you make some kind of mechitza. Also, you make the mechitza that is 10. The mechitza itself is 10 tvachim. Now, the Rashi is not good as what the Gemara says here. Bein l'mayla, bein l'mata. The way Rashi would be good is if you learn like Rashi, you take away the word bein, betoich oignoi. In other words, whether the wall had to be made, this partition had to be made specifically for this pit. If it's l'mata means that you put it inside the well, but mamish contiguous to the water, and bein l'mayla is it's still oignoi, it's still within the well, but it's, let's say, suspended above the water, and it's like 20 tvachim below the top of the well, and the wall is inside the well, but it goes up to 9 tvachim above the water. That's called l'mayla. Alamat is what's contiguous to the water. I don't care which one it is, as long as you have a specific wall for the boy. But the regular wall that they have that's partitioning the 2 properties, that doesn't count because it's a suspended mechitza, and mechitza tluya is not a mechitza. That's the opinion of the Tanakama. Mishim Gelula says no. I want you to know this itself is an argument between Beishamai and Basil. Beishamai says that you could even make it that the partition is could be within, as long as it's within the well, but above. And Beis Hill and Basil said it has to be contiguous. If you learn this version that comes out, Beishamai is lenient and Beis Hill is machmer. So Tosha says actually everywhere else the Girsa is all the way around. Beis Hill is the one who's lenient, and he says Mulmaila, but still it all has to be within the cistern. That means Shingul also agrees, but in the wall that's partitioning the two properties, that cannot count as a mechitza dividing the well as well because it's a suspended mechitza. Comes along. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, no, loy tehei mechitza gedola. You don't need an additional mechitza more than the wall that you already have partitioning the two, because Rabbi Yehuda holds that a suspended mechitza is a valid mechitza. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, and that's the machlekes in our Mishnah as well. We want to say right now that our Mishnah basically holds that a wall that ends above 3 tvachim from the ground is good enough because he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, suspended mechitza is good enough, and we're equating Sukkah to Shabbos. So I would say Rabbi Yehuda follows Rabbi Yasi. That a suspended mechitza works. However, it's not so. Why? Not Rabbi Yehuda hold like Rabbi Yasi. You cannot compare the laws of Sukkah to the laws of Shabbos. Now, why should it be different? Rabbi Yehuda is not hold like Rabbi Yasi, but Rabbi Yasi. So you know those Rabbi Yasi hold like Rabbi Yehuda. I'll say as follows. Rabbi Yehuda says that by Shabbos is that mechitza that separated the two properties is good enough. Rabbi Yehuda saw like Rabbi Yasi. Ad can look on Rabbi Yehuda Hashem. Rabbi Yehuda says that by Shabbos is good enough. We're talking about an Erev Chatzeres, which is only from the Rabbanon. But over here, in other words, the whole idea that one property cannot carry to another property is only rabbinical, because from the Torah, it's both a Rosh Hashanah. What's the big deal? The Rabbanon don't want you because you're going to carry from one chatzah to the next time you'll carry out in the street. So the whole thing is only the Rabbanon. So Rabbanon, so you know what? Even a suspended mechitza is good enough. Here you're trying to create walls for a sukkah matter. You need 3 walls, or 2 walls and a bit, and you have the suspended wall. That's not good enough. It's not a proper wall. It's not effective. No, Rabbi Yasi. So like Rabbi Yasi, Rabbi Yasi is lenient and says, suspended wall good enough. Only by sukkah, the mitzvahs I say. It's only mitzvahs I say. Therefore, the laws of walls by sukkah are different than Shabbos. Avo Shabbos, these are skillers. Shabbos overall. There's if you transgress one of the averes of the Torah, you get skillers. So even though this is only the Rabbanon, then everything on Shabbos becomes much more significant, much more serious, and much more chomer. Loino. You'll ask me a question. What about Maisa Shenasa B'Tzapayri? There's a story, an incident happened in Tzapayri, as we'll soon see, that they built these makeshift walls that will ended more than 3 tvachim above the ground. Al Pimi. Who did that go according to? The Chalef was in Tzapayri, and in Tzapayri, the rabbi of the city was Rabbi Yasi, but you're telling me that Rabbi Yasi does not agree that by Shabbos a suspended wall helps. So how did they carry the Sefer Torah there? So Moshe says, it wasn't the following Rabbi Yasi. You want to prove from that. Rabbi Yasi was a rabbi of Tzapayri. It says in Gemara you should go to Tzapayri for Rabbi Yasi, and we had in Gemara Shabbos a few tests that he was in Tzapayri. So it doesn't. So your question is, Rabbi Yasi is a rabbi of Tzapayri, so he must have paskin that a suspended mechitza is good enough for Shabbos. So Rabbi Bachon is right that the din of Sukkah and the Shabbos are parallel. Says you want to know. It wasn't Rabbi Yasi. Actually, he passed away already. His son became his successor. He became the new Rav, and he was the one who passed like Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Yasi personally, when it came to Hilchos Shabbos, he didn't agree to suspend the thing. From here, the Bach wants to prove in Shulchan Aruch that even though a rabbi ruled in a shul that something is asa, a new rabbi can come in and override that. Because you see right here, so you're telling me Rabbi Yasi would have said that these mechitzas are asa, and his son came along and changed it. Others disagree with the Bach, because nowhere do we find Rabbi Yasi clearly ruled that Shabbos you're not allowed to use suspended. We're just saying it, we don't know that he does. But if Rabbi Yasi Taka would have paskin on Shabbos, I don't want you to rely on suspended mechitzas, maybe no way that a new Rav could come into that shul and override it and said, you know what, even though this guy was machmir, I'm going to be lenient. So it's a big machlek is a paskin revolving around this little Gemara right here. Just see how the Gemara has all these tangents. Whether a new Rav can overrule the previous Rav and to be mekel. To be machmir is easier, but to be mekel. Says the Gemara, actually, if you read, there's a tshuva to the Rambam. Very interesting tshuva about this week's Pasha. It's in Aseres Adibris, he's supposed to stand up. So they wrote a letter to the Rambam that our city, we had a very big rabbi, and he was a big Talmud Chacham, and he came along, And he said, you're not allowed to stand up for a Seres Hadibris because you're acknowledging that certain parts of the Torah are more significant than others. And the Gemara says in Brachas that we didn't include Seres Hadibris in davening, so people shouldn't walk around and misconstrue what our action and saying, oh, so this is the only part of the Torah that's relevant, or something to that effect. And then they said a new rabbi came into town and he overruled the previous rabbi. And he said, you're allowed to stand up. And it's a big machlekes. What should we do? Anyway, very interesting letter to the Rambam, very interesting answer to the Rambam. Bottom line, the Rambam agrees with that rabbi. They shouldn't stand, they should sit. But also talk a little bit about if one rabbi can come and change the rules, where the other person is being machmer, thinking that you're not allowed to, what happens if you can overturn it? Others can say that's for totally different, because over there, it's not a question of one machmer, one matzah. The other one says, I'm machmer, I want to give cover to the Torah, that we should stand up for says the difference. So, interesting argument. Anyway, back to the Gemara. What's the story that we're talking about? They did not bring the Sefer Torah Erev Shabbat. So Rashi says that in those days they would not keep the Sefer Torah in shul; they would keep it at home, and because of safety reasons, because Ganav will come and steal it. So they did not bring the Sefer Torah Shabbos L'moch the following day. They wanted to bring it out to shul. Pirsu Sadinin Nagabim, they couldn't bring it. It was in a chutzah. They forgot to make an area in a chutzah. So I take my house to the shul. Or from one chutzah to another chutzah, and there was a street right in between. And forgot to make an shitufim avoyos. So what they did was pirsus adinin agabe amudim. There were a bunch of poles there. They spread out sheets, and therefore you had these makeshift walls. And suddenly now you have these walls, and one entrance was a shul, the other side was a house with a chutzah, and everything all right. Maybe it's every time they brought a Torah and they read it. Here all the Mepharshim talk about the famous halacha Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch talks about you now bring a Sefer Torah to a prison. Aruch HaShulchan says you shouldn't bring a Sefer Torah to a house unless you read it 3 times. That's only the Aruch HaShulchan's chiddush. It's not brought down in Shulchan Aruch, not in Alter Rebbe, not in Shulchan Aruch at all. But you shouldn't bring it to a prison. How come over here they bring a Sefer Torah? So there's an interesting discussion over here. What happened? Here you're doing it. If you're doing it covered HaTorah, a Torah is better to be read in a shul rather than a house. Then if you're doing it for the sake of the Torah, you're allowed to. And
why isn't there a problem of boina on Shabbos?
We'll see in a minute.
Because
as Rashi says, even though the wrong cases, if you have time, go look at it in the right. Rashi says there's no oil here. You mean oil? There's no oil here because walls is no oil. Oil is only by a roof, not when it comes to the walls. That's Rashi Shita, and his long cases it goes through the whole thing to see whether Taisa agrees or doesn't agree. The others want to say, by the way. Some the Achreim want to say that the din of a prison is talking about there's not a minyan there, and you bring in the Sefer Torah to people that are not a minyan. But if you bring it to a minyan, it doesn't matter where you bring it to, you're allowed to bring a Sefer Torah, even for one-off reading. Anyway, interesting discussion based again on this Gemara right here. So you just see how this Gemara in Sukkah has so many different tangents. Says what right? Pirsu Sukah Daf. They spread it out. How to bring it in the first place? So interesting to have a discussion. Why didn't it just get a goy and ask a goy to bring it? Because you're allowed to do a shvus l'tzoydich mitzvah, and especially shvus to shvus. We're talking about here telling a goy, which is a shvus for the rest of Shabbos, and carrying in this from one chatzah to another chatzah is only the rabbanon. So the shvus to shvus l'tzoydich mitzvah you're allowed to. You need to create a Torah. So someone will learn from here that you're not allowed to tell a goy to do things which has to do with learning Torah. You're only allowed to tell a goy mitzvahs have to do with mitzvahs, eating on Shabbos, so this is davening or whatever. But a goy to tell you, the whole purpose of the Torah is to do mitzvahs, so you cannot use a goy to go ahead and to tell you do Talmud Torah. Others say, in other words, they learn that the mitzvah of Kriyas Torah and Shabbos is a din in Talmud Torah, learning Torah. So therefore, you cannot get a goy to do anything in order to be able to have Kriyas Torah. Others disagree, and they say that Kriyas Torah is not a din in learning Talmud Torah, because there's actually a mitzvah to read the Torah in the shul on Shabbos. In fact, we had that, or we'll have that in Rosh Hashanah in Taisus there about when women make a bracha they got regarding mitzvah they're not chayiv, and what's the inyan of Kriyas Torah? Is it Talmud Torah or is it a separate mitzvah of reading the Torah? Anyway, in the land, so there's no game around. That's all. The sheets were already drawn. And they read it, even though the sheets were suspended above the ground. They were suspended above the ground. Says the Gemara further. So you have Amar of Chizas and Chizah, Amar of Imai, Machatzeles Arbo Umashu. If you have a mat, if it's 4 tefachim and a bit, materes besukah mishum deifen. You can use that. Remember, we had before the Zion. You can have a tefach, and then we said if it's a tefach, we had the 3 different versions of Rabba. Whether you need a tzudas pesach, how we when you need also tzudas pesach, alternatively a tzudas pesach, or with a tzudas pesach, or this becomes the tzudas pesach. And then we said if you have 2 parallel walls, and then if you want to connect them, you can make a wall that's 4 tefachim and a bit, put it next to within 3 tefachim on the wall, so you have a third wall that's 7 tefachim. So it says if you have a mat that's 4 tefachim and a bit, materes besukah shel deifen. We'll treat that as a sukkah when it comes to a deifen for a wall. In other words, why? What do you mean? Heichi avid talalei be'emtza. You we're talking about a vertical wall. You hang in the middle. Pachas mishleisha lamata or pachas mishleisha lamayla. So all you have is a wall that's 4 tefachim and a bit within 3 tefachim of the ground. So therefore you have lavud, and we'll say that what you have 7 tefachim of wall, and then within 3 tefachim of the schach above. So you have another less. You have 10 tefachim all up. So we know the laws of the rules of lavud. What are you trying to tell us? So we're talking about a vertical wall. You have 4 tefachim and a bit, and so on. We would have thought that you only say one lavud. You can use the same rule twice on both ends of the wall, on the bottom part to connect to the floor and the top part to connect to the schach. Kamash Malan. Meisvel asks a question. It says by a wall you can have a wall that's 7 tefachim. It sounds like it has to be 7 tefachim and a bit. So l'chayda we see you only do 1 lavud, not 2 lavuds. Says the Gemara, Kitanehi besukah daila. Talking about sukkah. In other words, the schach is much higher than 10 tefachim. Because the schach is much higher than 10 tefachim, then you cannot. You need the wall should be. You need 7 tefachim, a bit of wall. If the schach is within lavud distance of that middle wall, and the bottom part is within lavud, okay, you can use 2 rules of lavud. But if the schach is much higher than 3 tefachim above the wall, then there's no lavud. You can't use lavud to go upwards, and therefore you can only use lavud to go down. So that's why you need a wall of 7 and a bit. You need a wall 7 and a bit. So the Gemara, and once you have a wall 10 and a bit, it's a kasher wall. We don't care. We don't care if it doesn't reach the schach above it, right? As long as it's a kasher wall. Actually, the big machlek is the Shonim. We'll talk more about it Motzei Shabbos. If the schach has to reach mamish where the imaginary wall goes up, or you can also, the schach can be recessed a bit and use lavud going horizontally. In other words, you have lavud on the bottom, you have a mechitza 4 and a bit, so 7 and a bit, so you have now this 10 tefachim wall. The schach is another 20 tefachim above that, no problem. We'll say gurasik. And now the schach horizontally, you have to go in, let's say a tefach or 2 tefachim. Up to lavud. Can you do that? Or in this case, you say, no, you can't have all these different rules. You have to have schach mamish coming to the area where the walls would have, imaginary walls would end. So you want to make a master, but he come teach us, he's coming to teach us that we can suspend walls on Mailamata according to Rabbi Yasi. Right, you can suspend Mailamata because Rabbi Yasi, because you have a 7 wall tefachim, and in other words, the way that it doesn't say that this particular machzelas has to be within 3 tefachim of the ground. It's all it says is that machzelas shiva mashi was good enough. It doesn't say that it has to be within 3 tefachim of the ground, and therefore that it's a kosher wall. So maybe it's within 3 tefachim of the schach. So you have a wall of 10 tefachim, and even though it's suspended above the ground more than 3 tefachim, we don't say, oh, the goat can come underneath. In other words, this brayso is passing like Rabbi Yasi. Says the Gemara, sorry. Rabami says, "Pas arbo mashu mate besukah mishum deifen." Rabami says, if we have a wall that's 4 tefachim a bit, it's mate by a sukkah. We will treat it like a wall, like a wall. Says the Gemara, talking about if it's 10 tefachim high and 4 and a bit tefachim wide, we'll treat it like a wall of a sukkah. Now we're not talking about the vertical, we're talking about a horizontal wall. And you bring it within 3 tefachim next to a wall, so we have a 7 tefachim wall. As if it's attached. You want to make a master, what are you trying to tell us? So Gemara Kamash going to tell you that shear meshech sukkah ketana shiva. It's trying to tell you that the shear of a small sukkah is actually 7 tefachim. In other words, we had a big machlekes 4 amas, 7 tefachim, 6 tefachim. The halacha is 7 tefachim. Because we already know that, if you have, we know the laws of lavud, a wall 4 and a bit tefachim together with lavud is 7 tefachim, and the chiddush, that's for the minimum size of a sukkah. But interesting, Rashi says the very last line, a sukkah is 7 tefachim, v'zeh meshech sukkah tana, this is the length of a small sukkah, k'dei roishe v'ruba, your head and most of your body. Actually, your head and most of your body is only 6 tefachim. It's your head and most of your body v'shulchanei. Rashi misses the word v'shulchanei, which makes it a 7th tefach. Plus, I pointed out to you previously a few Rashis where Rashi says and Tosfos that it's 7 tefachim and a mashu, which over here seems to be omitted. Anyway, everyone should have a good Shabbos. We'll start from the Mishnah and Mitzvah and Shabbos, and we'll start at 7 o'clock.